I arrived in the House of Commons in 1984, in May the 3rd, 1984, and I decided shortly afterwards, when they made the worst mistake of their lives by putting me on the European Scrutiny Committee, and I was then offered a job in the government, and I said no. No? I said no. I said, if you give me a job, I won't be able to speak my mind. I said, and what I've discovered in the last few months, since I was put on this wonderful committee, is so important that nothing is going to stop me from continuing to make the case from the backbenches. And so 40 years later, I retired this year, and it's a bit of a wrench, but I've been able to accommodate it, and I'm probably working as hard now as I was before, because there's much work to be done. And now that we have a Labour government, as Barry has quite rightly said, is intent on rescission. It's not a reset, it's rescission. And the first thing they did, as the House was going into recess after the general election, so you have a general election, July the 4th. By the 20th of July, they struck the axe on the European Scrutiny Committee, of which I've been a member since 1984, and of which I was chairman for between 2010 and 2024. And that tells you as much as you need to know on the question of their attitude towards accountability. They were determined to get rid of anyone asking questions about what's really going on now. So I wrote an article in the Daily Telegraph. In fact, I wrote several, I do them quite often, and the Sunday Telegraph. And I pointed out that we were now in the clutches of a cabal of Remainers. And some of them are not only Remainers, they are actually Rejoiners. And the real question that lies at the heart of this is that they have this massive majority, and they have now got 411 members of parliament. We have only 121. And by the way, on the question of parliamentary accountability, I am bound to say that although I appreciate the fact that the Reform UK party has quite a few ideas in common with us, they've learned a bit over the years. The reality is that by having decimated 100 of our seats, and some of this is very difficult because we share a lot in common with them, but they have done a terrible thing in terms of the Conservative Party for this reason, that the accountability of Parliament on select committees is determined by proportionality. So there is not one single select committee in the whole of the House of Commons for the next 5 years which is going to be able to resist the continuous flow of socialism which Barry referred to, whether it's on taxation, whether it is on matters to do with the environment, energy. Every single one of them has a majority, whether it's a Conservative chairman or not. Home Affairs, immigration, every single select committee is now subjugated to the proportionality of the Labour Party, and that is very, very serious. Because you can get up at Prime Minister's questions, and you can raise questions, and you can have a bit of banter. But the real work is done inside the select committees. That is how, being on that committee from 1984 to 2024, I was able to do what I had hoped I would be able to achieve, and I'm so grateful to the British people. It was the British people. Some of us were catalysts. Some of us set out of ideas. Some of us fought battles. But ultimately, the democracy of this country was transformed by the referendum in 2016. And I remember that morning, two things in particular. having been up pretty much all night, and having to do some television and things of that kind. And I walked into the House of Commons, and it was very quiet. Most people were sleeping it off, whatever. But anyway, I walked into the members' lobby, and as I walked in, the door opened, and George Osborne walked in from the other side of the lobby. And he just said to me, "Well done, Bill, you've won." That was a tremendous moment. And I have to tell you that the other thing which went with it was, as I was coming back after having some breakfast and going down in the Westminster tube station to get the underground to go back to my flat, there was a chap who was a Guardian journalist travelling up the escalator as I was going down. And he said, "What does it feel like to have 17.4 million people agreeing with you?" And that's another lesson I shall never forget. Now, this is entirely, ultimately, a decision taken by the British people. Many people thought that we weren't going to win. I always believed we would. And that night, I did manage to get to bed fairly early because I knew I was going to be up during the night itself. And I woke up. I suppose it's kind of serendipity, really. Maybe it was instinct, I don't know. I put the wireless on, and I heard the Sunderland result. So I turned back and went back to sleep again. I knew that was that. So those are some anecdotes about the sort of things that one gets involved in the parliamentary process. But I'm now having to look down the barrel of a Labour Party, as I said, engaged in this rescission, this determination to change the terms of trade. And I think it's highly probable, I can't put it higher than that his objective is what he and some of his closest colleagues have always wanted, which is to have a second referendum in the next Parliament. I don't think they'll do it this time. And actually, come to think of it, they may not get the chance to do it at all, because what they've done has been so appalling. And I got the figures, which I won't bore you with because you'll know them already, on the polling that's going on right now in the country. And Keir Starmer is now on his back. The Labour Party may have a big majority, but never forget they only had 35% of the vote. And only on a 60% turnout. This is the point we need to remember. We have every conceivable reason for believing, if we get it right, that we will regain power, as Churchill did, Barry, 1945 to 1951. He was thrown out. We were back within 6 years. This can happen again if we get our act together. And the way the Labour Party are going at the moment, I wouldn't put too much odds on them winning the next general election at all. So one of the things I thought I'd mention now was the fact that 190 years ago, there was the Tamworth Manifesto. Robert Peel, the great man, one of our greatest ever prime ministers, who changed his mind. He had been in favour of the Corn Laws. He got into Parliament, I think, round about 1814, 1815. He was with those who wanted to keep the Corn Laws and stop free trade, right up until John Bright, who is one of my forebears, I have to say. You may not know that, but it's true. And his friend Richard Cobden, those great free traders, as Barry referred to the great free trading policies which we need to maintain the open seas. That's what it's all about, as well as conservative values and conservative principles. And he changed his mind when he heard Cobden and Bright speaking from the back benches. And he turned to his Chancellor of the Exchequer, a man called Goulburn, and he said, "You must answer this, for I cannot." And he took him to dinner that night. And they sat together and he said, "Tell nobody, I'm going to repeal the Corn Laws within a year. That was in 1845. In 1846, he did it. And of course, as with the European issue, with which I put it on the same part, in fact, the European issue, funnily enough, is even bigger, because the question of repeal of the Corn Laws and free trade was an economic aspect of the government of Britain. The whole of the European issue is everything. As I often say, sovereignty is democracy. From that democracy, we govern our country. So the whole question, which I've again repeatedly said in the House of Commons, is who governs this country? Who governs Britain? This is a British issue. It's not just a European issue. The Europeans can go their own way. What a hash they're making of it right now too. Macron, Olaf Scholz, a kind of arrangement he's been seeking to make, by the look of it, with Putin. All these things are the consequence of an imploding Europe, politically and economically, and most emphatically, electorally. Think of all the countries in Europe which are now lining up with us. They're not appearing to do so by changing their constitutions, but look at the position in Italy, Meloni. Look at the position in Germany, the AfD. I may not be a huge advocate of some aspects of some of their policies, but it's the fact that the people, as in our referendum, are turning against this monstrous, completely unreasonable, insane policy of trying to create a European integrated system amongst nation states who have no ability to come together on the basis of any rational political philosophy.
Absolute rubbish.
Absolute rubbish. Who's the gentleman there? Oh, fair enough. Anyway, the position is that the countries in Europe are absolutely and completely going in the wrong direction, and yet the Labour Party are trying to join up with them. And this is where the problem lies. So back in that 190 years ago, Disraeli wrote this amazing book. It was called Coningsby. And in the middle of it, for those of you who dip into it, there was a moment when he asked the question which we have to face now. And the question was, what are the conservative values we have to conserve? The awkward question naturally arose, he said, after the Tamworth Manifesto. What are the principles we have to conserve? And Disraeli, in his inimicable fashion, said, the Conservative Party is a national party, or it is nothing. He meant nothing. So our entire philosophy turns on the issue of who governs us as a national party. And one of the great ironies of the situation, ladies and gentlemen, is that these so-called Remainers and Rejoiners call themselves the One Nation group. And as Margaret Thatcher, if I may bow to her for a moment, once said, they're not a One Nation group, they're a No Nation group. And I fished out of my archives recently a pamphlet written in 1965, 67, something like that. And I looked at the list of the people who were signed up. The pamphlet was published by the Conservative Political Centre, and I read it again a couple of days ago. And it said, One Nation Tories, One Nation Conservative Group. And the title of the pamphlet, published by the CPC, was One Europe. But what is astonishing is when you look at the membership of that One Nation group. It included people who, in their wisdom in due course, completely changed their minds. I don't criticize people for changing their minds when they see the truth, at all. As I said, Peel did it. Thatcher was part of the referendum campaign in 1975. And the same goes for these others. And believe it or not, I won't go into all the detail, just simply to tell you, one of them was J. Enoch Powell, another one was Ridley. There were several of them who changed their minds over a period of time, and they did us proud when they did. So I don't criticize people for changing their minds. What I do say is, once you've changed your mind, stick to it and don't ever give up. The last point I would simply make is this. The Labour Party is abandoning all the principles of good government on defence, on the question of woke, on the question of social values, on the question of planning, private property, inheritance tax, taxation generally, abandoning small businesses, abandoning the pensioners. The litany is phenomenal. And so I say to you, we have an enormous task ahead, a mountain to climb on the appearance of what is happening, with only 121 Conservative MPs. But the Conservative Party has been through this before, and I think in a sort of relationship of some kind with those who went away from us and voted for reform, who are true Conservatives as well, I'm sure, we will be able to get over this next 6 years and win the next election. But it has to be on the basis of those values and those principles which Disraeli and Peel stood for, and which Churchill stood for, and the great Margaret Thatcher stood for. This is the way forward for the United Kingdom. This is the way in which we rebuild our amazing historical return to power. And I simply say to you, stay with it. Never give up. That is the key point. That is the test. You stay with the principles, you stay with the values, you stay with the reasons why this country was great. Think of our fantastic history, how we've defeated Napoleon, we defeated Hitler. We have done amazing things in our time.